Welcome to the session on space and power in the Conference on Surveillance and the Humanities. And it's my pleasure to host this session and to chair it. Before we begin, I would, of course, like to acknowledge that those of us in Canberra, at least, are meeting on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Of course, many of us are on Indigenous land all over the world, and I'm sure you will have your own ways of paying respect. So we have in this session on space and power, 3 speakers. We were originally going to have 4 speakers, but unfortunately, Aliette Ventéjoux is unable to join us. Just before I go into some of the protocol, I will send, let's see if it's possible through the Q&A, probably not. I think I can through the chat to all panelists and attendees, send the YouTube link to Aliette's presentation, so you can watch that later at your leisure. But we will have, nevertheless, 3 excellent presentations. And we will start with Lucie Cluzel. Lucie will be speaking about safe cities. And I'll just say, I'll introduce each speaker as I introduce their talk. And when at the end, I believe that's the best way to do it, we will be accepting questions through the Q&A function. But I'll just let you know for the moment then that Lucie is a professor of public law at Paris Nanterre University. She's a member of the Public Law Research Center and of the Research Center on Administrative Sciences. Her field of expertise is digital law with a focus on law governing the use of algorithms by public authorities and of data to monitor public policy. Just before she starts, I just want to remind everyone that the session will be recorded, and so that your questions will also be recorded, and will hopefully at some point be able to view all of the sessions in this conference. All right, so without further ado, Lucie, please.
Thank you very much. I'd like to question the rise of safe cities in France from the point of view of fundamental rights. In a context of terrorism and health threats, predictive policing experiments have developed in several cities around the world. Police forces, such as in New York, Atlanta, and others many countries, now rely on software, including the iconic Predpol, to better deploy their forces and better prevent police disorder through algorithmic predictions. Some French cities are increasingly interested in it. The problem is that the development of these techno-police experiments is risky for fundamental rights. Indeed, some cities, by promoting a smart city policy, they are actually committing themselves to this security perspective. So let's go back to what the smart city means first. The idea of smart city, apparently born out of a discussion between President Clinton and John Chambers, then president of Cisco, emerged in the second half of the 2000s. To quote the definition given by the European Parliament, a smart territory is one that seeks to respond to issues of general interest through digital solutions enabled by a partnership between a multitude of factors. Breaking with the traditional silo organization, the smart city is based, first of all, on a transversality and interconnection of services and networks, energy transport, urban lighting, etc. The smart city is also characterized by the omnipresence of digital technology and data. It is based on a large stock of data fed by sensors scattered all through the territory. This data can only be processed by sophisticated algorithms. Finally, cross-functionality, the key word of smart cities, implies rethinking the government the governance of territories by integrating not only elected officials and administrations, but also economic actors, associations, and citizens. The potential of smart city is considerable. Reduction of energy, smarter journey, better management of certain public service, better accessibility, but it must be noted that although the promises of the smart city are numerous, the security prism is often dominant. In the context that we go through, cities are seizing digital technologies to set up data surveillance. Predictive police experiments are based on the use of various files that can now be cross-referenced with data collected by sensors scattered through the city or carried by the people themselves. Experiments combining video surveillance, geolocation, and biometrics are beginning to emerge in order to prevent threats, improve the detection of events, and reduce the time required to mobilize the forces available to deal with them. We speak of intelligent video surveillance based on the analysis of images to detect signal of abnormality, sometimes coupled with facial recognition algorithm for identification purposes. These experiments based on co-production of security lead to a decline of the role of the state. The problem is that the activity of private actors is not sufficiently supervised and the protection of freedoms is not ensured. Population surveillance tools were initially firmly regulated, but nowadays, considering the terrorism threat, the health crisis, and the budgetary pressure, the balance between police measures and the protection of freedoms has become fragile. I want to highlight 3 points. First, I will present some safe city tools, and then I will see that new actors are involved. And third, I want to highlight the risk for freedom. I will first present some examples of safe city tools. Surveillance was initially based on file-based surveillance. While the French have always been very hostile to the generalized filing system, this system is now accepted. Even biometric data are more and more collected. The police files have also multiplied once again in order to control populations. This surveillance is coupled with an intrusion into digital communication system facilitated in France by the laws adopted after the 2015 attacks. In addition to these devices, there are increasingly sophisticated video surveillance networks. For example, in Marseille, a big data observatory of public tranquility was inaugurated in early 2018. The project consists of an integration platform based on big data and machine learning network methods. It is a tool that should make it possible to aggregate many databases, such as that of the city's General Delegation for Security, which lists, among other things, police complaints and verbalizations, or even in the long term, data collected by the video surveillance network, hospital data, or social networks. In Saint-Etienne, another town in France, a neighborhood has been equipped for the past year with around 20 microphones designed to pick up weak signal of abnormalities, accident in civilities ranging from a simple shout or honk to detonation. These sound sensors trigger cameras, which then orient themselves on the origin of the suspicious noise and speed up the arrival of the police or emergency services. This experiment is to be continued by the use of drones, like in Paris, we had it a few days ago, which would make it possible to avoid mobilizing unnecessary resources, but also by a reporting application enabling citizens to report the municipal police or incivilities and other problems they witness. And that's the second point I want to explain. The growing technicalization of the police is contributing to the privatization of the security movement that began in the 1990s in France, joining many Anglo-Saxon states in this way. Indeed, nowadays, whereas it is prohibited to delegate police activities to private sector in France, the fact is that security is eventually co-produced by private sector and by the population. Public contracts are concluded to enable well-known multinationals like Thales, Atos, Bull, or Suez to develop these predictive policing systems. The question is who, local authorities or companies, ultimately control the data collected. There is a risk of privatization of the city because companies enforce their economic model, which is based on the monetization of individual data and advertising. At another level, the contract signed in 2016 and renewed in 2019 between the Homeland Security Direction and the American company Palantir is criticized in France for giving access to operational data processed by its software. These security measures also had the particularity of mobilizing citizen vigilance, watching neighbors. Through the multiplication of reporting applications available on smartphone or connected objects, citizens are called upon to participate more and more in the surveillance of the city. This contribution, or crowdsourcing, is transforming the role of the police and therefore the role of state. This decline in the role of the state is all the more problematic as the activity of private actors is not sufficiently supervised. The protection of liberties is not guaranteed. And this is the third point I want to explain. Population surveillance techniques, which are particularly intrusive to privacy, were initially firmly framed by the law to contain the infringement of fundamental freedoms. But gradually, the balance between police measures and the protection of liberties has become fragile. Just before explaining this point, a question should be asked. Why would we still seek to protect privacy at a time when individuals no longer hesitate to reveal the details of their privacy on social networks? This is where all the ambiguity lies, described as the privacy paradox. Revealing personal elements, whether real or fake, on the internet does not mean that one wants to reveal everything about oneself. Privacy is that area of intimacy that one chooses not to give. Although transformed, this fundamental freedom therefore still exists and must be protected, perhaps even more so today than in the past, given the breaches that new surveillance techniques bring to it. Unfortunately, the conclusion must be drawn that there is a lack of legal protection. Smart surveillance systems increase the risk of violations of freedom. For example, the Big Data Observatory project in Marseille aims the analysis of tweets and the monitoring of conversation threads in order to assess the risk of dangerous gatherings. It endangers privacy and freedom of expression. Indeed, how can the anonymity of individuals be ensured when the observatory aims precisely to aggregating and cross-referencing a maximum amount of data, most of it identifying? How can we be sure that these tools will be not used to track members of a particular religious community, as was the case in the United States for Muslims and as it is the case today in China for Uyghurs? Also, even if such treatment is not used for discriminatory purposes, it is in any case a potential factor in the amplification of discriminations, as some studies have shown. The freedom of the inhabitants of sensitive territories who are logically stigmatized will therefore be even more restricted than those of other inhabitants. The problem is that regulation facilitates the use of these systems. In France, all that is required is an administrative authorization, but it is very easy to obtain. The binding rules of the European General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, only apply if personal data are processed. This is not always the case. In Saint-Etienne, for example, the recording of abnormal sounds does not give place to for the moment to identification. Therefore, the GDPR does not apply. But if the capture is coupled with a recording of data, sounds or images, allowing the direct or indirect identification of persons, the device would be subject to the GDPR. The deployment of thermal camera in some schools to measure the temperature of students and teachers since the pandemic, what is considered by the administrative judge as falling within the scope of personal data protection law, as well the implementation of facial recognition devices in high schools, because such device process personal data. But even so, it is very difficult to ensure that the principle of the GDPR, such as the principle of finality and proportionality of data collection, as well as the consent, are respected. Of course, the judge is vigilant. For example, concerning the thermal cameras installed in schools during the health crisis, the Council of State ruled that the fact that children's access to school is subject to acceptance of the use of temperature taken by thermal camera excludes in any case that consent can be considered free. To conclude, the judge's intervention, as reassuring as it may be, is nevertheless based on the vigilance of associations for the protection of fundamental freedoms. It is, in our opinion, regrettable to have to rely on litigation rather than on a legislative framework adapted to these new digital uses. Nevertheless, it would seem that in some countries, more robust regulation is beginning to emerge, for example, in New Zealand. We look forward to the next European Union artificial intelligence regulation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucie, and I'm really glad you were the first speaker. You've sketched out a number of really broad concepts and issues and questions that I believe the other speakers will take up in different ways, but also I want to remind people that we will have a Q&A at the end, and can you please submit your questions through the Q&A. Lucie, perhaps you can turn off your microphone now. And we will now move to Gavin Smith, and Gavin will be talking to us about the work of watching and being watched. Gavin's an associate professor in sociology. I'll just let him load his PowerPoint while I'm introducing him at the ANU. And he has specialized in the study of facial recognition and the biopolitics of recognition. His work, his first major work is called The Work of Watching. That's why I stumbled over that. And I think that this presentation that Gavin will be making will dovetail quite nicely with some of the things that Lucie was talking about. So please go ahead, Gavin.
Thanks very much, Caroline, and really enjoyed Lucie's presentation too. Before I commence, I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work and from which I talk with you today. I wish to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's sovereignty over this land was never ceded, and that struggles for land and other rights as well as for justice remain ongoing. I'm Associate Professor Gavin Smith. That's my Twitter account if anyone wants to jump on and follow me. I post quite a lot of stuff about some of the things I'm going to be talking about today, briefly. So my talk's called The Work of Watching and Being Watched, which is something I've spent a fair bit of time conceptualizing. And I know I was only allowed to provide one slide, but I actually have broken the rules and provided 3. So sorry for that. I'm just going to start off by saying a little bit about my interest here on conceptualizing practices and experiences of surveillance in everyday life, which is really where most of my work has been orientated to, really starting to problematize in some way the dominant kinds of theoretical conceptual readings of surveillance as being largely about the automatic functioning of power. And surveillance kind of operating as this kind of conduit of power flows and circulation and circulations, and that's often been as a consequence of scholars understandably looking at the architecture and infrastructure of surveillance technologies and systems and kind of reading off quite important but in some ways quite simplistic and non-empirically driven accounts of how surveillance operates and what kinds of effects, differential effects it has on the people and things the gaze is projected over. And so in many ways, I'm kind of, in some ways, you know, talking about here some of the, you know, the ghost of Foucault's work, for example, in the ways in which an awful lot of conceptual theoretical work about surveillance has kind of rightly flagged up the asymmetries of this governance, the fact that the governance is being done to someone or something through a kind of a machinery, an apparatus of power. And, you know, there's a watcher and there's a watched within a, you know, a panoptic or some kind of, you know, architectural spatial arrangement where there's a sort of an asymmetry and unaccountability of that governance. And of course, there's lots of many different ways of theorizing those relations of power. And I'm not gonna, I don't have time to go into those right now. But suffice to say, surveillance has, you know, often been kind of, you know, understood and presented as being this kind of unequal relation of exchange of visibility and a gaze and a kind of a mode of power operating on a body or a social body. And what I really want to, what my work's really been interested in trying to reveal through ethnographic field work is, you know, the fact that these kinds of conceptual frameworks often, I think, overlook the subjective experience and messy realities of performing surveillance. And I mean that in the sense of what I'm going to just put forward in this paper today, very briefly, is this kind of dialectic I have that I'm kind of working with, which is at one level, the work of doing the watching and starting to think about the nature and character and ontology of that kind of work in terms of how that produces this kind of surveillance relation, surveillance practice. But also equally, I'm very interested in this kind of work of being watched, of being rendered into some kind of visibility relation, you know, subjected to some kind of gaze, whether it's from externally and some kind of system looking upon some person to kind of, you know, visualize them, to watch them, to monitor them, to turn them into binary code, whatever it might be, or whether it's actually someone, you know, gazing at themselves through a digital device and looking at their interiority and trying to map their bodily dynamics and flows, whatever. So on the first hand, this kind of idea of the work of watching, and what I'm really interested in is this kind of movement that we're starting to see from, you know, a very kind of human-centric kind of surveillance gaze, which is being, you know, and you see this beautifully depicted in this picture in the top right here, of a CCTV camera operator looking at the screens to try and identify risk, to try and, you know, find and locate suspicious bodies in space, in this case in the urban environment, and then track them, monitor them, you know, watch them as they move around that space. And I've done a lot of research on this kind of life world, and you'll see in that book that Caroline's referenced previously, my monograph, looking at in an ethnographic perspective, the kind of everyday operating culture of CCTV operators in the UK, and looking at what kinds of meanings they imbued their work with, how they kind of, you know, projected their subjectivity onto the screens to locate bodies that were, you know, out of place or disorderly kinds of spectacles on the screens. And what was very interesting about that ethnography that I sort of revealed, to kind of challenge that simplistic reading of surveillance as being all about power and power distributions and power asymmetries, was that actually the operators were very affected by their labor. And it became very obvious to me by spending quite a lot of time in those control rooms that, yes, although these people were projecting their kinds of fantasies, their kinds of ideas about deviancy and risk onto the screens and trying to locate you know, disorderly, unruly events and spectacles, actually what was very interesting to me was that they were very affected by the reflection of what they saw on those screens. So in a sense, you know, they were witnessing in a very kind of strange distantiated way, like from a distance, but in a very virtual, intimate way, kinds of lots of forms of behavior that were actually distressing. So, you know, people being beaten up, in street brawls, or people that had been hit by cars, or even seeing things like people committing suicide, all sorts of people taking drugs and begging, and all sorts of difficult, traumatic kinds of scenes, which they were expected, of course, to capture through the camera in meticulous detail that could then be presented as evidence in court. And those kinds of encounters with those kinds of spectacles, or distressing spectacles, I found really affected and impacted on their subjectivities, such that they would have to generate lots of coping strategies to kind of distance themselves from that kind of witnessing, that kind of absent presence in those kind of mediated realities on the street. So fascinating kinds of social relations at that micro level, which I think really troubled those simplistic notions that these people were kind of voyeuristic agents occupying those kind of centers of calculation in the panoptic tower, subjecting all in those kinds of cells to that kind of meticulous gaze. Yes, there was certainly aspects of that, but there was also this other story about having to learn techniques to process that kind of mediated suffering that they routinely encountered. Now, what I'm very interested in too here is this sort of movement we're seeing from almost a displacement of humans from being behind the screen to, of course, algorithms starting to take on that kind of work of watching, of subjecting what they are, what's being seen to these kinds of algorithmic judgments and, forms of recognition to try and identify, what's being seen on the screens, and then box it as a risk, risk profile metric. So I guess my question I'm really working with at the moment, and I've just written something about recently in Big Data in Society, is that how do these habits of mediated watching change in form and feel as human enacted practices of witnessing are progressively replaced by non-human machinic forms of witnessing? And so I'm really interested in facial recognition technologies and their increasing kind of appearance in public space, and these kinds of watching repertoires being enacted by non-human entities, these machinic flaneurs that engage in practices of what I've called the distantiated flannery, subjecting the mundane and extraordinary properties of the urban environment to dispassionate, mechanistic and calculative gaze. What I think is really interesting is, what kinds of politics that sets up, what kinds of, changing kinds of forms of watching work we're going to see emerge when humans are kind of increasingly the last point of interpretation in this kind of watching chain. But so much of this is going to be done, and you can see this in this bottom picture here on the right, of, in a COVID society, in a pandemic, we're now seeing these kinds of automated flaneurs assessing how close, physically close, people are to each other and giving them a kind of a score level, and obviously alerting some potential operator there to, breaches. We're seeing kind of thermic recognition appearing where at airports, where people are in hospitals, people are being scanned and having their temperatures taken from them. And so I'm just kind of interested in this kind of movement towards this kind of machinic form of surveillance, and what kinds of implications that might have. We can maybe talk about some of that stuff in the ensuing discussion. But what's very interesting here is I'm just coming to the end of my time here, is the way in which these programs of AI, as they relate to kind of surveillance work, are, it's very much couched in these kind of terms. The artificial program will be watching, we won't be. And I find that really interesting in the way in which part of the legitimacy and justification and rationale for this kind of move towards algorithmic surveillance work is that it's better that a machine does it than a human, a much more judgmental and discretionary, discriminating human gaze, that this machinic gaze is somehow more value neutral and objective. And I find that very interesting. The last point I'm just going to quickly make as my time seeps up is I'm very interested in this kind of work of being watched too. The fact that increasingly publics, individuals are being subject to all these different modes of tracking, and their bodies are becoming leaky in broadcasting. And we're, very much it's situated in screen culture, where people are constantly witnessing themselves and others through the spectacle of the screen. And what I'm really interested in here is the ways in which, increasingly as we're rendered into data through this kind of encounter with different digital devices and infrastructures, this kind of need for impression management in terms of how we care for all of this data flow that's kind of leaking off our bodies into surrounding institutional containers and different audiences who are kind of reading us through our data signals and making decisions and judgments about us, our risk scores and profiles, or our worthiness, and so on and so forth, through what our data says about us. And really what I find very interesting here, I'll finish on this point, is the way in which people are becoming very seduced by the capacity to see themselves in a different light through digitalization, through self-tracking and the quantified self, and kind of being able to optimize their bodies and curate particular impressions and personas to different audiences on social media and so on and so forth. Just as they are, I would argue, also feeling, insecurity and modes and forms of exhaustion from this kind of labor of having to try and control what is known about us, as it kind of seeps effortlessly off our bodies into these different sort of technospheres. And the kind of work that people are doing to stylize a desirable impression of themselves, and how difficult that becomes as more and more kind of machinic gazes, contact our bodies and, extract data from us. So I'm kind of interested in, to sort of summarize and conclude, the labor that goes into this kind of surveillance relation, the fact that it always involves work as much as it involves power. And that work really needs to be mapped through detailed ethnographic and empirical kind of work, to field work, to really kind of get at these complexities, these messinesses and these nuances of how people are actually living with surveillance in their everyday lives. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gavin. Perhaps you'd like to stop sharing your screen so that we can make room for Denis Beaubois. And one of the unfortunate things about not having Aliette here is that we didn't have her discussion of Jonathan Raban's surveillance novel, but we do have another way of interpreting creativity through a creative artist himself. So Denis will talk about his work in the event of Amnesia, the city will recall. And he's looking at surveillance systems from a different perspective altogether through his work as an artist who has exhibited at major cultural institutions, including the Tate Modern and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Australia. So with fingers crossed, we will turn to your screen, Denis, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Hello, everyone. Unfortunately, I don't know. Oh, my slides are working, which is great. Okay, so I'd like to talk a little bit about a project that I did in 1996 called In the Event of Amnesia, the City Will Recall. And I've set it up so I want to actually show some video as well as part of it. Now, I hope that's going to work, but you'll just have to bear with me. So I'll just go ahead and tell a little bit about the project, and hopefully we can tease it out a little bit further towards in question time. So In the Event of Amnesia, the City Will Recall was a performance project that occurred in 1996 in Sydney. So I want to talk a little bit about the performances that occurred as part of this project. And but before I do, I want people to look at this through the optics of 1996. It's a historical work. It predates social media, and it also predates this whole notion of surveillance through an algorithmic prism. So this is quite important. A little bit of background about the project. These are the slides that I have showing some old photographs from my family's albums. Now, the identity of these subjects here have been lost. We know that they're part of my family, but we don't necessarily know who they are. I always liked how these disappearing images seem to mirror their lost identities. So slowly the images has decided to fade away as well. Looking at these images in the 90s when I was studying photography, it made me question how else could people be remembered outside of the personal records of family and friends, and where else could one's image be stored, retrieved, and eventually recalled. Around that same time, in the mid-90s, in Sydney, there was an adoption of CCTV system throughout the Greater Sydney, that is. Noticing this, I wondered if these cameras could also be used to document an individual's identity. So I entertained the idea of possibly repurposing these surveillance cameras as a type of off-site photographic album. This was the catalyst that led to an interest in surveillance. It did not stem from an Orwellian critique, but rather came from an interest in photography, and possibly from also reading a little bit of too much of Roland Barthes in Camera Lucida. I was always interested in the camera's link to power, the power to remember, to capture an event, and to use it as evidence of what took place. The power to counteract time by freezing that subject onto the negative, then making us aware of our own mortality as we looked at it. But it was the power of the camera to subtly influence the actions of the subject that was particularly relevant in the creation of the Amnesia piece. Barthes talks about this in Camera Lucida, and he basically states that he discusses it as a process of modifying one's action when faced by the lens and transforming oneself into an image in advance when faced by the camera. It was this process of altering one's actions for the record that was about to take place that I saw as performative. So the camera had the propensity to draw out the performative from its human subject, whether consciously or unconsciously, and that interested me. I initially explored this idea by photographing a series of audiences who came to view performances. I attempted to flip the convention where momentarily the audience were forced to consciously adopt the role of performer to be observed by the camera. What interested me here was the bluntness with which this idea was materialized by the camera. All who came into the field of view of the lens were consumed as characters to be retrospectively observed as performers. But it was the project in the event of Amnesia the city will recall, where these ideas became fully realized using surveillance cameras around Sydney as ready-made audience, and also as a repository to deposit one's identity. So this is the initial slide from the project. I basically selected 12 sites around the city of Sydney where surveillance cameras were prominently placed. And these sites were used as performance locations for a period of 3 days. The performers' actions were directed to the camera, which adopted the role of audience. No permission was sought for the use of these sites. I announced, unannounced, and carried out my actions. I'm going to try and flip to some video. So I think in order to do that, I need to stop share and then start sharing again. So please excuse me. Let's see. Okay, so here's a little bit from the project, and this is basically on the first day. And I'll talk over the top of this in order to contextualize it. Let me drop the sound. So day one of the performance was about becoming a suspect. The purpose of this action was to separate myself from the other bodies that cross the surveillance camera's field of view. The aim was to use a vehicle of suspicion to transform the surveillance camera into a captive audience. The action undertaken was simply to stand in front of the camera and return its gaze. This act of looking had a dual purpose. The first was to offer my visual identity to the camera, allowing it to clearly document my features and my existence. The second was to mirror its gaze and to draw attention to its presence. Looking at the camera set into motion a public dialogue about surveillance and a private dialogue about performance, particularly who was fulfilling the role of audience and who adopted the role of performer. So I'm just going to switch over to day 2 and fast forward a little bit. It should be around here. And for the second day, I returned to the site, and using a card held to the camera, I warned them that they may be photographed reading this sign. So this was, on the second day, it was all about trying to broker an introduction between myself and the camera. It was an attempt to reveal a little bit more about myself, and in a way, it was a way to telegraph the dialogue that was about to come. So within this context, it's an urban context, there exists an interplay between what I've termed and coined as the primary and secondary audience. The primary audience is the targeted audience, a person or congregation who is willing to observe and assess. For the camera and for the amnesia piece here, you can see the primary audience is the camera. Their willingness to observe is not based on the longing for entertainment here. It tends to be order-driven and stems from a necessity to assess and monitor the designated terrain. They have somewhat of a watchdog consciousness, and you can see it scan the field for suspects, clues and leads. And when it realizes that I'm no longer a decoy, it focuses upon me. So like many audiences, it assesses the scene first and attempts to preempt the plot. When the primary audience reacts to the event, I found that it also adopted the role of performer. So here we have a situation where both parties, myself and the surveillance camera, are locked into performance. And when this occurs, the secondary audience is introduced. So the secondary audience exists because of the location of the action. The sites chosen were courtyards, walkways, and thoroughfares, locations of travels and transients. It's an audience of chance that is self-directed in its choice whether to stop and pay attention or whether to quickly ignore the event. It's an audience that is basically entrenched in the glance as opposed to the gaze. So, and it tends to fly through and quickly catch a glimpse of the event. Now, I'll just play a little bit from day 3 in the background. And day 3 was about trying to foster a simple dialogue and try to elucidate a response from the camera itself. So, on the third day, I returned to the site and attempted to have a simple dialogue with those behind the cameras using a series of placards. As you can see, I asked for a copy of the video footage, and I asked the camera to move up and down to agree or side to side to disagree. And I was trying to communicate directly and have a response directly from this apparatus. So what began as a playful attempt to deposit my identity to as many surveillance cameras around Sydney developed into an exploration of the performer audience dynamic in relation to the public surveillance camera. These ideas were also explored in other performances that form part of the Amnesia project. And I'll just try and switch to the other performances now. So hopefully you can all see this. And so this was the other performance. It was called The Accidental Contract. And here, the accidental contract tends to rely heavily on the secondary audience. I located myself here with basically my gaze hidden from the passing public, and it made me an object for the pedestrian's gaze. I could safely be looked at unchallenged. However, once they tended to look at me and read the sign, they realized that they could be recorded as well. I'm holding a small surveillance camera in my hand, and in this hand, I've got a photographic camera as well. And you can see here, people tended to walk by and see the action and be documented. And I've got a little bit of video that I'd like to show again, if possible. Give me a... Okay. So, screen. Great. So here you have the dynamic which is set up by the accidental contract. On the right, you see the viewpoint from the camera that I'm holding, and the screen on the left shows you my documentary camera. And I like this work. It's a very simple work that tends to draw out, once again, the propensity to, for the people once faced by the idea that they're being recorded or that there's a camera, it tends to draw out this notion of the performative. People tend to want to perform to the camera. So the accidental contract tends to rely heavily on the notion of the secondary audience as performer. And once again, it relies strongly on this idea of an audience that's not locked within the notion of the gaze, but that of the glance. And finally, there's two more works, short works that I'd like to show. And this is the red light camera portrait and also the ATM camera portrait. And you can see here, the red light camera was a very simple work where I located myself in the middle of an intersection where a red light camera was placed, and I got one of my associates to drive through, therefore triggering the red light camera. And once again, this was a continuation of the idea where I wanted to try and use the city's existing cameras to try and deposit my identity in them, use them as I mentioned before, as an offsite photographic album. And the same thing occurs here with this idea of the ATM Family Portrait. And this work plays with the idea of the family portrait convention. And this time I used an ATM automatic teller machine, which had a camera inbuilt. And on the 1st of, I think it was the 1st of July 1996, as you can see down here, I turned up and withdrew some money out of the ATM with my extended family, my parents. And
excuse me, Denis, we can't see the images you're referring to.
Oh, you can't see it. Okay, sorry. You are screen. Have you been able to see any of them?
Yes,
Okay.
it's still on the warning you may be photographed reading this sign.
Okay, thank you. I'll just try and stop and start again. How's that?
It's now visible. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that. So this is the final ATM Family Portrait, and so once again, as I mentioned, I turned up at a certain location, which was in King's Cross, and I used the ATM machine. And this was the only piece of work where I had to negotiate with the authorities in order for it to work. I really enjoyed with the other works from the Amnesia project that the authorities weren't necessarily directly or consciously involved. I used the existing platform which they laid out, and through context, I managed to coerce them or corrupt them into being co-performers. While in this piece, I had to have the cooperation of the bank in order to obtain the proof of the documentation and obtain the photograph from the ATM Family Portrait. And if you weren't able to see the ATM Family, the previous works, maybe
we were able to see that.
You were able to see that, great. Okay, well, I'll leave it at that. I've gone over time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denis. We've moved from the work of being watched to the play of being watched and watching, but I think nonetheless still capturing some of the major issues that are at play with space and power. We have two questions that have been submitted, one through the Q&A and one through the chat already. The one in the chat, perhaps all of the presenters could take a look at, because it isn't directed to any one person. And it's a fairly lengthy comment, so I don't think I'll take up time reading it. But if any of you would like to touch on the issue of, are we on the cusp of techno-humanity? This is a very broad question, but I don't want to deprive the person who submitted it of the opportunity of having it addressed. Anyone like to take a stab at it?
I'm happy to. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. It's a huge question, and it's one that's take probably another hour for us to discuss, I guess. And we all have slightly different perspectives on it. But I think it's a you know, the techno-humanity notion's useful. It's obviously, these things are novel in some ways, but they're also not novel. They've got a long historical kind of, you know, situatedness. So like, you know, it's always worth, I think, with that question, not just fixating on the present, but kind of looking back at these kind of antecedent sort of forms of techno-humanity. And I guess as a sociologist, my answer to this is always much more, is ambivalent actually, in the sense that, you know, I think it's very easy to see these kinds of infrastructures and systems in one light as being kind of like, you know, encroaching on our liberty and autonomy. And of course, they absolutely do discriminate, and there's all sorts of differential effects of these technologies operating on us. But it's worth saying too, that they're always messy in their operational realities. Their everydayness is always kind of like transforming, moving, indeterminate. And I've seen enough in the work I've done, and I've done a lot of empirical ethnographic work on different manifestations of digital devices which double up as surveillance tools. And I can see, you know, that these things are never perfect. They're never as their designers intended. And there's always, as we've seen with Denis's paper, there's so much agency running through these things as they get embedded in the social, and their social is always transforming them in really, you know, interesting, curious, idiosyncratic ways that I don't in any way want to doubt the fact that power is always being leveraged in one way or another, and often differentially depending on the color of your skin and where you are. But there's always the agency, the techno agency, as well as the social agency to disrupt, challenge, and undermine, as well as, you know, technological failure happening all the time and dissent. So yeah, I leave it in that very ambivalent kind of interpretation.
Lucie, perhaps your presentation was emphasizing the power and the increasing power of the algorithmic approach to surveillance. So do you have a
can,
different perspective?
Yes, I can answer to the question too with my lawyer's eye. It is true, we don't have any agency to control AI use. We only have personal data protection agencies, but that's not enough. We can regulate the use of AI, and the idea would be to regulate it at the international level. Already the European Commission is thinking about an adapted legal framework, but it is very complicated because the lobbies are very strong. That's a big point to make a framework, an international or a European framework. It is very difficult because lobbies are very strong. And they don't want any frameworks, even if they say that they won't provide, they won't give any recognition systems to states if they don't have frameworks. It's hypocrites, I think.
All right, Denis, if you don't mind, we'll move on because we only have a few minutes. I would just exert my chair's privilege and suggest that Ausma's question has been addressed in part by Gavin's earlier response, and I'd like to open it up to Desmond, who has a question.
Yeah, look, and I'll just keep it very brief to say, I thought it was a really great collection of papers, and they really spoke to each other in a really interesting way. But they left me with a real question about well, let's put it this way. Lucie presents the kind of notion of the fundamental rights of privacy and the ways in which our current regimes undermine that. But what we hear from Gavin, and in fact, I think what we saw from Denis too, is a world in which people are constantly watching and being watched, in which their relation to that are everyday and, complicated, nuanced. And I'm just wondering what evidence there is about how people actually feel about the right to privacy in the world that we now live in. What evidence do we have about how important people feel it is? As Denis says, when given the opportunity to perform in front of the camera, people perform in front of the camera. To the extent that this is becoming increasingly ubiquitous, how important do people themselves actually think that the language of privacy is? Or is it something that increasingly does not speak to how people experience and think about the world?
Denis, perhaps you could address that?
Yeah, so I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, we can.
I think it's interesting because I find that the idea of I think it's Lucie basically raised the notion that people are interested in sections of privacy. It doesn't have to be a complete total screen which separates all sections of information from being filtered through to companies or through to government. But what I find also is maybe well, from 1996, I think it's changed. It's changed dramatically. I found that in 1996, when I was presenting this work and discussing it at panels, there seemed to be this notion of an Orwellian dystopian regime lurking around the corner. But I feel that with the advent of social media, it seems to have been heavily questioned by various generations. I think there is a a counteracting force between privacy and between the need to be seen, the need to be optically active, the need to be public, because I find that a lot of sections of society really find that it's a fundamental drive. It's like if you don't exist out online, if you don't have that level of immersion, you're no one. It's like you fade into insignificance. So I'm not quite sure about what the evidence is because I'm not a researcher. I tend to work within ideas of the visual arts. But what I do find interesting is, I don't know if you're familiar with Willem Flusser's work, and he wrote a really quite interesting essay on the photographic program. And the photographic program is a program that is ubiquitous, that everyone participates in, regardless of whether or not you want to do it or you don't want to do it. As long as you have a camera, you're participating in the photographic program. And I feel that this idea of data collection and surveillance has bled into this field. I feel like we're all agents that are kind of creating data sets for for larger companies and so forth. So I feel that this idea of purposely withholding information is it's somewhat anachronistic. It's a different level, and I don't fully have my head around it. And this is one of the reasons I've stopped making works in the areas of surveillance, because it became a little bit, I don't know. I wasn't sure where to situate it and where to critique it and what angle to take. Yeah.
I thank you very much, Denis. I think I'd have to disagree with you. You are a researcher, and that was a very rich response. So thank you. And I would also agree with Desmond that the papers took very different perspectives, very much complemented one another. I do need to ask the organizers, we are over our allotted time. Can I take one more question or not? Okay, Yelena has been waiting patiently. I know there are other people, but I'm trying to go in order of the questions. So go ahead, Yelena.
Thank you very much. Originally, I had a question for Lucie, and it was a more legal question. I apologize to everyone else. But if I could just add on to that, and it's connected, the whole point of now that everyone wants publicity, then where does that leave the right to privacy? I don't think the law and the courts have yet lifted their hands from protecting the right to privacy. I think what matters is that those who don't want publicity as an individual will not be then vitiating their entitlement to privacy, whatever that looks like, because society has identified a particular trend that goes, well, I think that's the point of an individual juridified right. But leaving that to one side, my question for Lucie was, the French courts use the GDPR, as other courts in the EU do as well. What about Article 8 of the European Convention? And the reason why I asked that is because very recently the English and Welsh Court of Appeal held that in combination with Article 8 and the GDPR, police use of facial recognition was unlawful, and it overturned the High Court decision. So that was a confirmation. But do you have anything to say about that in the French context?
You need to unmute yourself, Lucie.
Yes, sorry. Yes, we use both Article 8 and GDPR, that in France, we don't need, in fact, Article 8. We only use GDPR and an internal law of the protection of personal data, internal law, which is old but very effective. It's from 78 and it's very effective. So for personal data in particular, we use GDPR and this law and this internal law. And for protection of privacy, we can use the Article 8, but it's not necessary to use it. I don't know if I answered well.
Caroline, can I just make a very quick rejoinder just to Desmond's point? Because,
yes, certainly, and then this will be the last one before we close.
Yeah, Desmond, I thought it was a really great question, and I just wanted to add, I mean, I think what I perceive is that, you know, context matters, boundaries matter. So in one vector, which might be social media and an assumed close group of friends, sharing images of the body is absolutely fine and normal and naturalized. Yet, when a university comes along and says, we want to use AI in exams to do digital proctoring, and we're going to do a little bit of biometrics on, you know, each student's, whether they're cheating when they're doing their exams, suddenly there's this kind of like politics and collective consciousness. So I think boundaries, borders, and, you know, risk, and kind of like, you know, really the sense of personal boundaries and space as they get mapped onto the virtual realm is really, really fascinating. And you do see some, you know, inverse kind of like politics of, you know, people that feel they're being persecuted by a speed camera, for example, using their digital cameras to take pictures of the detection technology, trying to, you know, capture their overspeeding and then circulate it onto Facebook to warn other motorists about where those mobile vans are that are being run by private contractors, for-profit contractors. So like, it's just so messy, the social reality of surveillance and how it's kind of like situated in all these different cultures and is generative of those cultures. I think it really does come down to each individual's sense of, you know, their personal boundaries and how much they understand where their data is flowing, and that sense of control or lack of control over how those impressions are getting decoded and kind of read. So that would be my kind of slightly elongated answer to your question about context and boundaries.
And I think that's a very good point on which to end. Sorry, I was just looking at the tweet from, or sorry, the chat from Anne. That's why I merged the two words. So I think this is a session that has really raised quite a lot of questions, not just for us as researchers, but in our personal lives, and the whole question of what the contextualization of the notion of privacy. So we can now leave it for everyone to go back to their own private thoughts, and we will leave the message, but leave the session. I'm sorry I didn't get to everyone, including Alison Young. Hello, Alison. And this is, however, as I mentioned earlier, a recorded session, so perhaps the participants might look at the questions that were in the chat that we didn't get a chance to look at, and if you know the person, they've identified themselves, you might want to communicate with them further. So Anne has also left information about further sessions, and you will also be getting the usual email reminders about next week's and further week's sessions. So thank you very much for your questions, and especially thank you to the presenters.